Bezrat Hashem, we're gonna learn today. We have actually, unfortunately, we have two neshamot to learn. Tomorrow night, Bezrat Hashem, is the yahrzeit of my father. Yosef ben Moshe from Ukraine, as we said. And also, unfortunately, the Shiva just finished for a very dear friend of my wife who has nobody to say Kaddish for him. So we're going to learn today, Bezrat Hashem, Leilui Nishamot Yosef ben Moshe veChaim Moshe ben Melech. Ruach Adonai Tenachem B'Gan Eden.
I'm sorry.
So we're learning today for my father's yahrzeit is tomorrow night, and then also, unfortunately, a very dear friend, former colleague of my wife who just passed away, unfortunately, at a young age. I consider somebody my age young, so and so, they both made very special contributions to the world, each in very different ways. Anyway, so we shall learn Torah in their memory and for our own strengthening. שלא יארע דבר תקלה על ידי ולא אכשל בדבר הלכה וישמחו בי חבריי שלא אומר על טמא טהור ולא על טהור טמא ולא על מותר אסור ולא על אסור מותר ולא יכשלו חבריי בדבר הלכה וישמח בהם כי אדוני ייתן חוכמה מפיו דעת ותבונה גל עיני והביטה נפלאות בתורתך. So we always have to pray not only that we're learning Torah, but that we're learning it right. You know, that people say practice makes perfect, and that's not true. If you practice wrong, it makes you very, very unperfect.
Sounds like Prince Lombardi.
So you have to practice. Well, my father, as we're speaking of, was a native of Green Bay, Wisconsin. So
practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice.
Perfect. Exactly. Thank you. So first of all, we had a couple of open items from last time, and I have like 5 pages of notes here. I'm not going to read all of it because otherwise we'll be here until Wednesday. But there were a couple of questions, I guess, that came up, which I think we should revisit. One question that was raised was when we say "V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha," love your fellow as yourself. Does that apply to non-Jews as well as to Jews? The Torah's answer is yes, and Rambam says explicitly, as we saw in Hilchot Yesodei, for example, Rambam says explicitly that non-Jews also have access to Olam Haba. The rabbis make it very clear that non-Jews not only is their prayer heard, but they have a chiyuv to pray. They're allowed to bring sacrifices and offerings. And
why is there B'nai Noach?
I'm sorry?
If they're B'nai Noach.
You know what? I'm not going to argue about it. I mean, we, the B'nai Noach, meaning everybody but Jews. Or you mean if they accept?
If they choose to accept B'nai Noach. Otherwise, they're praying to other gods.
Okay. If they pray to the same God that we pray to. That's the second question. Okay.
I said
So, we say in the Sephardic and the Hasidic nusach of the Amidah, in the bracha of Shema Kolenu, or Shema Tfilatenu, right? It ends with Ata Shomea Tfilot Kol Peh. So it doesn't differentiate, right? God listens to prayer, and I can't argue or answer whether God actually hears the prayer of a non-Jew who prays to Avodah Zarah. I can't answer what God does with those prayers. I don't know. I know that if we go, Pesach is coming, and I know that if we look very carefully at the text of the Haggadah, we'll see that there are two texts from Torah that are put side by side. There is the text from the book of Exodus, and there's a text from the book of Deuteronomy. And they both tell the story of us leaving Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. But if you look at the text of the book of Exodus, it does not have the word prayer in it. And in fact, the words that are used to describe the suffering, the complaints of the Israelites in Mitzrayim are not even words of speech. It's moaning and groaning and crying out and so on and so forth. And I think it's Rambam who says, or Ibn Ezra who says, it was like the suffering cries of the wounded lying on a battlefield, right? And it says God hears the suffering, and then God decides, okay, it's time to do something, right? Fast forward to the book of Deuteronomy, which says, how are we going to recast and retell this story when we are now, Baruch Hashem, in our own homeland? And when Mehera Ibaneh Beit HaMikdash, when we, actually are bringing the Bikurim, how are we going to retell that story? We want to take, as they say, we want to have our own agency in that story. So we want to raise ourselves up. It's not dishonest and it's not a revisionist. It's reviewing and looking at ourselves now, looking backwards and saying, oh, how far have we come? We've come to the point now where we understand what it is to pray. And halavai, in another generation, or even tomorrow, we will have a newer and a more enhanced understanding, each of us individually, of what it is to pray. Because each time we pray, we're like adding to the practice. And B'ezrat Hashem, each time we pray, we're getting a little something extra, we're learning a little something extra. So in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, we prayed to God and God took us, God heard our prayer and God took us out, that's the way we understand our lives today. Baruch Hashem, we don't understand what it was to be slaves. Baruch Hashem, we don't understand what it was to not know that a God exists, much less to know how to pray to that God, much less to know that that God cares about us and wants to do something for us. Okay? So it took us a lot of work to get to the point of where we are today. And B'ezrat Hashem, we still have a lot of work to do going forward. So, ein ladavar sof. And finally, on that point, the Rambam makes the point that...
Are you saying they didn't pray in the first version? They were just groaning?
That's what the text says explicitly. It doesn't use the word prayer, and quite a lot of the commentary on it says exactly that it was just moaning and groaning.
They were so crushed, it was hard to pray, and the groaning was like a type of prayer in itself.
That's the way we interpret it in the book of Deuteronomy. That's exactly what I'm saying. So in the book of Exodus, if we had nothing but that version of the story of the Exodus, we would stand here today and we would say, isn't that wonderful that like when we complain, like God knows what we're complaining about and takes care of it and we don't have to connect to God. Fast forward to the book of Deuteronomy, and the book of Deuteronomy says, that was then. But now we have a different relationship. We have a different understanding of our relationship with God. And in fact, we have a different relationship with God.
Well, wouldn't it have been passed down from Abraham and Yitzhak and Yaakov? I mean, you see where Yaakov was praying for his wife, their children, and we see many times.
Yitzhak, not Yaakov. Yitzhak. Prayed for children.
Yitzhak, excuse me.
No. Yeah.
Yitzhak, yes, you're right. Yitzhak.
Yaakov actually refuses to pray. When Rachel says, come give me children, he says, what am I, God? It's like my fault?
Right, exactly. But you see they had examples of the forefathers.
Well, this is a whole separate conversation. My understanding of it and my argument is that by that point it had been completely lost. And I think that's part of what the Midrash is talking about when the Midrash says we fell to the 49th level of Tumah. And if we'd fallen one more level lower, then we never would have been saved. So there was a lot that, you can argue that we had some kind of spiritual DNA, maybe, maybe not. But by that point, even if we had it, it was buried so deep that we were not in touch with it. In fact, we did not have a national identity. We did not even identify ourselves as a group. Remember, who calls us Am Yisrael? Not us. Shvotov. It's not us. We don't say we're Am Yisrael. Paro says we're Am Yisrael. Paro says, wait a minute, all these people, they're actually like a nation, and they're getting to be too many. We have to do something about it. So we've really fallen far from whatever level of identity, understanding of our place in the world, understanding of even of the existence of a God, much less of the nature of God, much less of the nature of our potential relationship with God. We've come very far down from that, from the times of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov.
Even the Goys pray.
Excuse me?
Even the Goys pray. I don't see why he wouldn't pray.
Well,
I mean, like, you see,
Tzarechim.
I see people that don't go in any religion, but they still see him praying to God.
That's today. I don't know. Tzarechim. You know, it's something that bears a lot of contemplation. And we have from now until Pesach to start preparing and thinking about it. And then you have the Seder to sit and wonder. And wow, how far have we come? Just last point on that. I mean, I'm not trying to be dismissive. This is a huge discussion. Rambam also says, no, I get it.
I like to interact like this because it makes me see the picture better.
Thank you.
It makes me draw out of you things you might have not said.
Thank you. You have my book? Oh, it's time you read it. I'll see you afterward. Now, Rambam also makes the point that the Torah is as, I believe he makes the point, not in this sefer, but I believe he says that the explicit commandment to treat the stranger well and be, accepting of the stranger is mentioned as many times as the mitzvah of Shabbat. And therefore, Rambam says the Torah elevates the acceptance and the proper treatment of the stranger to the level of Shabbat. And he says, because it says, Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. So he's not talking about people who convert to Judaism. Because in Mitzrayim, we did not become Mitzrayim. Right? We were separate and apart, and we were, for 200 years, we were honored guests, and then for 200 years, we were slaves. And isn't that interesting how quickly that can reverse? Okay, and we've seen that throughout our history. The second point, again, I just want to keep coming back to, and I think from the conversations that we've had, I think it's a real bracha for me and for all of us to actually be talking about God, which is something that Jews don't do a lot of. Right? Jews talk about halacha. They talk about, sometimes they'll talk about, even people who address, the Kabbalah, it's more about the structures, the Kabbalistic structures and the Kabbalistic understanding of how the universe works. But, and maybe this is something that's kind of missing, not just from Jewish discourse, but from contemporary discourse in general, is that we've gotten far away from God. And the purpose of the halacha is not merely to, put on our tefillin and keep kosher and say Kiddush. Those are all important things. Those are all essential. We can't fulfill being Jewish without them. But the purpose of the halacha is to help us and guide us to behave in a godly way. And the Chazal say, how should we model our behavior? God is compassionate, we should be compassionate. God is merciful, we should be merciful. God is patient and understanding, we should be patient and understanding. So in order for us to model ourselves on God, we need to actually have some kind of an image of what that means. Judaism is not much engaged with the theological discussion. But again, when we have said that people do not pray to the same God, and if we say in the Aleinu prayer, well, the Ashkenazic Nusach has taken it out, but the Sephardic and Hasidic Nusach says in the second paragraph of Aleinu, Em mishtachavim level varik, and then Sephardim and some Hasidim say Umitpalalim el lo yoshia, and the Rabbi took that out of his Siddur, and I'm not sure why. And I asked Rabbi GoldBerg about it, and he said he wasn't sure either. But the fact is that
how is that sentence? The second one.
Hem mishtachavim lehevel varik, that they, meaning the not Jewish people, bow down to emptiness, to something that's just
But then you said something else.
Umitpalalim. Do you have a ask?
Oh,
thank you. Umitpalalim el lo yoshia, and they pray to a God who is not capable of salvation.
It's a God they made up.
It's okay. Perhaps. I mean, we're all
what do you say?
we're all in our own way.
God they made up.
To the extent that we're trying to understand what God is and what God does, we're all in our own way, kind of in a process of making up God for ourselves too. As
Except we have a Torah to guide us.
We have a Torah as a guide, but nowhere in the Torah do we open a page and have a clear photograph or a clear checklist that says this is exactly what God is like.
Because he says we can.
Exactly. However, we're about to Bezalel. I just want to I don't know, well, some of you guys are like almost as old as me. So you may remember,
You're younger.
was it 1996? Was any of you guys out of diapers in November of 1996? November 9th, 1996. Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield. Anybody? Okay. And you may remember, which to me, the high point of that night was, it was a great fight. I'm not a huge fight fan, but that was that's the kind of thing, like you can't not watch that. And it was a great fight. It's like I'm not a big baseball fan, but when the Yankees are in the World Series, because I was living in the Bronx, of course I had to go watch the World Series, right? But after the fight, they were interviewing Holyfield in the ring, and then all the way down the corridor to his dressing room, they said, "So Evander, tell us about the fight." And he said, "Well, I put my trust in the Lord, and the Lord came through for me. I trust the Lord." And then he got more and more excited about it. I don't know if you remember this, right? Because Mike Tyson had just come out of prison. He had gone to prison. He came out. He converted to Islam, and it was a whole big deal. And he came down to the fight. Remember? Yeah. And Evander's saying, "My God is greater than his God. My God defeated his God. I showed him my God is great. With Jesus, all things are possible. My God defeated his God." Right? So let's be clear about it,
So
folks.
Holyfield won.
Sorry?
Did Holyfield win that?
Yeah. And he was like a 28-1, underdog. It was a great fight. It was like anyway, he's a great boxer. But the point is that we should not, I really believe more and more. I've said this I said this first time, I don't know, several weeks ago, and I've been thinking about it quite a lot. We should not be lulled into believing that everybody believes in the same God. And I thought this through, and part of and I mentioned this last week, I just want to really emphasize, I think it's a really important point for us to bear in mind, because the theology is not up there. The theology is here. And when Chazal tell us God is compassionate, you too should be compassionate. God is patient, you too should be patient. They're not just instructing us how to behave, they're also telling us what human beings do. And remember when we quoted from the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah says to Cyrus, the Persian emperor, "No, I am God, I create light and darkness, I create good and evil." And Cyrus is like, how, even today we're having a hard time wrapping our heads around that, okay? That God also creates evil, and evil comes from God. And that goes against a lot of what people tell us, a lot of what Orthodox rabbis tell us, okay? But who are you going to, fine. I have no disrespect to any, to my fellow Jews or to my fellow Orthodox rabbis, but who are you going to go with? Your local Orthodox rabbi or Prophet Isaiah?
How come they changed Yisroel or
How come they changed it to Uvorei Hakol?
Yeah.
Because I think, it was like one of these things, people don't want to have to be reminded every day. If it's Hameh V'Yavin. But they had to make it acceptable for everybody. They did, we say it every morning, right? This is the opening of the Shacharit service. Yotzer or v'choshech, oseh shalom u'vorei et hakol. We don't say you created everything, not create evil. But the original pasuk is God says, "I create evil." So
And we
again,
see in this parsha that Hashem is suppressing his compassion. And Moshe has to talk about it.
right?
That's
Nachon.
pretty amazing.
Nachon. And it's not the only time that Moshe has to do that, right? So the point that I think this, if you are, again, this is there's a whole series of books to be written about this, and a whole hours and hours of conversation to have on this. But I just want to revisit it, that if you live in the world of what I understand to be Cyrus's world of Zoroastrianism, which is what's called a Manichaeist view of the world. Like there's one God. Zoroastrianism was, on the one hand, it was a monotheistic religion, but it was a monotheism with a kind of an Avodah Zarah overlay. And the Avodah Zarah overlay was that there are forces of evil and forces of good, forces of light and forces of darkness. And the whole of cosmic history is the war between the forces of evil and the forces of good.
It's not a unified view.
So, right, it's like the God, it's like as I understand, it's like an unreachable God that's way up there, and then there are all these forces that are at war here. So if you live in a cosmos which is expressed in terms of the forces of good versus the forces of evil, you're going to see the world in black and white terms. And you're going to interact with people by you meet somebody, it's a psychological truth. It's like in our hardwiring as our animal being, that a third of the people that you like, you're going to automatically like, that you meet, you're going to automatically like. A third of the people that you meet, you're going to automatically feel like, I'm not so sure I like this guy. And a third of people that you meet, you're going to be totally parv to you. Okay? That's just the way we're wired. Okay? However, if your understanding of God is the world is a war between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, when you meet those people to whom you initially have a kind of opposite magnetism, right? Your mind, you're going to say, oh, this guy's evil. This person's evil. When you have, it leads to this kind of mental instability, right? You meet somebody, you become friends with them, and then they say something that you don't like, was unexpected, whatever. You say, I didn't realize you were evil. And that's the way your mind is going to work, because you're going to say, this is the way God created the universe. So we have a much more complex God, because our God actually creates everything. And not only didn't just create it one time and flip the switch, but it's an ongoing process, right? Which means that and renews it constantly. Which means that, welcome, which means that we are bidden to model our behavior at that level of complexity, which means that we always have to be asking questions. We always have to be saying, maybe I didn't understand this properly. What else can I learn? Which means that anytime we have a negative reaction towards a person, our first obligation is not to say, see, I knew you were a bad guy, but it's to say, okay, how come I'm having that reaction? What's going on here? That we are in a sense commanded, but Chazal tell us to model our behavior on God. We are commanded to operate at a constant level of plumbing the complexity of life. It's a tremendous gift. It's a tremendous obligation, but what a gift. And so, yes, so for example, Purim coming up, as Hashem, where we're going to actually, many of us will take on, if you will, the dark side. And we will take on that persona, and we will try to embody it. And you know what? My bracha for us is to those of us who dress up as Haman, let's not try to dress up as Haman and say, see, I'm the wickedest person in the world. Let's try to dress up as Haman and say, I wonder what it felt like to be this guy. We could go to something as simplistic as just saying he must have had a really unhappy childhood. And he lived in a culture that supported a black and white view of life, right? He lived in Persia. He lived in a culture whose whole view of the world was good and evil. So I got to distance myself from this and I got to run to that. And that's indeed what he did. And he chose a very easy target to paint as evil. And, it may not have been something that he made up himself. I'm sure it was, it may have been something in the water, right?
But choosing the lottery is very problematic, don't you think?
It's a form of divination that was used, in the ancient world, and it's used today. All right, heads I go here, tails I go there. Heads I marry this one, tails I marry that one. It's kind of
thought out of the problem.
How different is that, right? Exactly. So, with that said, the third and fourth prakim that we are going to launch on today are, how shall I say this? We have to get through them. They are Rambam's kind of cosmology. It's Rambam's view of how the cosmos is structured. I'm not going to get into whether it does or does not, as they say in Yeshivish, whether it stims or not with modern science. I think that, those arguments are, maybe of academic interest. I think they don't help us, because my purpose is not to try to figure out where the Rambam was wrong and how we make him right. It's to try to understand the Rambam from inside, Bezrat Hashem, which it means that, we're going to look at Rambam's view of how the cosmos is structured. And I would say, if we're going to think about anything, I would encourage us to think not, does this match modern science, not match modern science, as he got it right, as he got it wrong, but rather, how does this percolate down to Rambam's understanding of how the world works and how we should behave within the world as a result.
By the way, have you heard of Zamir Cohen?
I've heard the name. I have no idea what he does.
He's a Kabbalist.
Okay.
A Sephardi. And he wrote a book about the relationship between science and, as you want, cosmology and all what pertains to it.
Right.
It's incredible. It's
Yitzhak Ginsburg does the same thing.
Okay. So, chapter 3. Hagalgalim, the spheres, right? Some of you may remember, what was it, Ptolemaic cosmology, right? From your high school ancient history, right? Hagalgalim, hem hanikraim, shamayim, rakia, zavul, va'aravot. The spheres are called, they're the heavens and the firmament and the habitation and the skies. Okay? Galgal, vehem tish'a galgalim, and there are 9 major spheres. Okay? Galgal hakarov mimenu hu galgal hayareach. So the one that's closest to us is the sphere of the moon. And the second one is the sphere of the planet that's called Kochav, which is Mercury. Galgal shlishi she'lema'ala mimenu shebo noga. That has the next one is that contains the sun. I'm sorry, the planet Noga. And then the 4th sphere has the sun. Interesting that the sun is in the 4th sphere and the sun was also created on the 4th day. But, I only work here. Galgal Hamishi. Okay, so let's just read this in English because it has the different names of the planets spelled out, which are different. Okay, the 5th sphere is the planet Ma'adim, which is Mars. Ma'adim, like Edom, red. The 6th is the planet Tzedek, which is Jupiter. The 7th contains the planet Shabtai, which is Saturn. And the 8th is all the stars. And then the 9th, וגלגל התשעי הוא גלגל החוזר בכל יום מן המזרח למערב והוא המקיף ומסבב את הכל. This is the one that turns all day long, constantly revolves each day from the east to the west, and that surrounds everything. Okay?
Say the orbit?
Well, again, the spheres are. Let's read this quickly, and then we'll kind of, try to visualize how this works. I mean, basically, he's going to say that and he's going to use this exact language. He's going to say the spheres are there's no emptiness, no void between. There's no space between the spheres. It's like they're lie upon one another closer than the skin of an onion, than the layers of an onion, and they turn, and again, and they turn, and so they. What does it mean? I don't know. And again, I'm trying to avoid saying, well, this was the science of the time and whatever, but basically, yes, this was the science of the time. That the spheres and what is referred to, you might have heard the expression, the music of the spheres was a mystical concept of like, if you really get into a profound spiritual meditative state, you can you hear like this friction as the spheres rotate and revolve because they revolve at different speeds. Okay, so this is, and then the planets and the stars, he says, all seem to be in one sphere, even though they're at different levels, right? And this is why because the spheres are completely transparent as glass, as pure as refined glass, or as a sapphire. And therefore, the stars that are in the 8th sphere can appear to be lower than the 7th or even than the 1st sphere.
Physical distance doesn't matter in this because Mercury's further away than Mars is. But Venus.
He does get into some measurements, but this is not primarily a treatise on astronomy, but he does give us some measurements. And now each of the 8 spheres in which these different planets and stars reside, right? The 9th sphere encompasses everything, and it's kind of the motor that turns them all. But think of like a Rube Goldberg kind of a clockwork thing where just because one is turning at a certain rate doesn't mean that all the others turn at the same rate. They turn at different rates in slightly different directions, depending on their nature within the mechanism. And each of the 8 spheres in which the planets and the stars reside, they are also divided into many spheres. And they're up. Some of them are, so to say, higher than others, and some are lower than others. And I would say higher and lower. I think it's safe to say, in terms of physical location, is with respect to the Earth, which is at the center. Okay. And they're above and below one another, kimo gildei betzalim, like the layers of an onion, right? And so from mehem galgalim sovavim mima'arav lemizrach, mehen sovavim mimizrach lema'arav, and some of the spheres turn from the east to the west, and some of the spheres turn from the west to the east, like the ninth sphere, which turns from the east to the west, and there is no empty space between any of them. Right. So those of you who, I donated a copy of this here, so it's around here somewhere.
Excuse me.
If you, please.
Why this is not in Moreh Nevuchim, but in Mishneh Torah?
You have to ask Rambam. You have to ask Rambam. Why?
Because Mishneh Torah has got a different purpose.
Yes. Yes, but the Sefer Ma'adah, I think the simple answer is Mishneh Torah. The purpose of Mishneh Torah is to teach us how comprehensively how to behave, to follow the Torah, to be properly observant Jews, right? And as we said before, it's not enough to just go down the checklist of I did this mitzvah, I did this mitzvah, I did this mitzvah, right? But the purpose of the mitzvot is to train us to act in a godly fashion, to train us to have a connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says at the very beginning of this, right? Our purpose is not to eat kosher and keep Shabbos and put on tefillin. Our purpose is to come to know God, which is a lifelong and indeed a many Gilgulim long process, and we may never get to it. But he says that the purpose of studying and understanding both science and Torah is to know the truth. And our purpose in knowing the truth is to do what is true because it is true. There is no ulterior motive. There is no, I get a benefit from it. Okay? And so he said, so Sefer HaMadah, it's kind of like he's giving us foundations of understandings and attitudes. He's trying to prepare, it's really a foundation. He's trying to prepare a groundwork for us so that when later on we look at the mitzvot. For example, we can look at, so after this, B'ezrat Hashem, we will move on to Hilchot Yesodei, where Rambam talks all about the inner structure of the human psyche, right? So the human psyche, if we look at the inner structure of the human psyche, and we have in our mind what we're reading right now in the third and fourth parak, and we say, wait a minute, so the universe is made up of different spheres, and they move at different times and but they all interact. And sometimes something is far away, but it looks close. And sometimes something is close and we can't even see it. And sometimes something is, et cetera, right? And when we understand how the cosmos works, there's a kind of it's like what they call fractals, right? Where the same pattern repeats over and over and over and over again, okay? If we understand how the cosmos operates at the highest level, we bring it down to the human level. We look at the human being, we say, interesting, the way that our emotions are intertwined, the way that our feelings and our intellect interact, the way that we can that something is so close and we can't even see it, that something is so far away and yet it seems bigger to us, right?
If so, this Perek Shlishi, we should think is more important than what the scientists say. In this particular.
Okay, so I said at the beginning of this, I don't want to get into comparing, this and science and this and that, right?
That's why I asked you why not.
So what I'm saying I'm saying that it's not, I don't want to argue about it's important, it's more important. I will say that Rambam is a champion of science and of scientific method and scientific knowledge and scientific discovery, which is already in contrast to a lot of his contemporary rabbinic teachers, and which also continues to be in contrast to a lot of what we're taught today in mainstream Orthodox Judaism, okay? And at the same time, he doesn't say that science is more important than Torah. However, he does say, not right here on this page, but he does say that halacha needs to make sense. And there are points, I can't pinpoint, I don't have it at my fingertips right now, but there are a couple of spots in Mishneh Torah where he picks in specific passages from the Gemara, and he says, but now we know this is not true. in terms of like mitziot, in terms of like, how the physical world operates, right? So science is not more important than Torah. However, science is, he gives science a cheshivut, an importance that it would.
You said before, emes and sheker. So this must be emes.
This is the Rambam's emes, right? What we're trying to do here, first and foremost, is to understand the Rambam like from the inside out, right? Instead of saying, oh, Rambam says we have to do this, let's go do it, right? And again, I think it's a real bracha that we're spending so much time on theology, which Jews quite often don't do when we study, right? But how do we learn to imitate God if we don't have some kind of an understanding of what that means? I'm not saying that we can understand God, but unlike a lot of other, whether it's Sifrei Halacha or just the way a lot of rabbis teach, right? Rambam at the beginning of Sefer Madah says that our job is to come to know, to try to find out, to try to come to an understanding of what this whole thing is all about. And in a sense, and because of the way that he writes it, right? Again, go back to the very beginning, right? Yesod ha-yesodot v'amud ha-chokhmot le'da sheyesh sham matzui rishon v'hu matzeh et kol hanitza. The foundation of everything and the foundation of all wisdom is to come to an understanding, or to come to learn, to try to figure out in an intimate way, right? Leda it's intimate knowledge, right? But it's not ladat. It's not to have the knowledge. It's to gain the knowledge. It's very, very critical difference, right?
Process.
Okay, it's about process. And a lot of people will tell you, no, you have to know that there's a God. How do I know that? Well, it says. Oh, good. It also says that Jews run the world. It also says, pick your newspaper, pick your book, just because something's in print and it's come down to us for many generations doesn't mean that, first of all, doesn't mean that the second generation understood it the way the first generation understood it, the third, the second, fourth, et cetera, et cetera. So it comes down to us today. And how do we know what they meant when they wrote it? Number one. Number two, it's in print, so it's true. But I can show you something that's in print that goes exactly against this. No, Rambam is not that simplistic. Rambam is saying the Torah is vast. God is more than infinite. We don't have a clue, but we must devote our lives to trying to understand this. And there are lots and lots and lots of guideposts. There are lots of signposts along the way, not least of which is the Torah. So Rambam says, you know what? I did a lot of thinking about this, and I think Rambam does not say, I understand this, you don't. Rambam says, I've thought about this long and hard, and I figured out a better system for trying to understand things. But when Rambam says, the way in which God knows everything is too complex for us to understand, he's not telling me and you, don't bother asking because you won't understand it. I think what he's really saying is, listen, even I didn't understand it. So please don't ask me to explain it to you. Okay.
When he says a better system, what is he referring to?
Well, as we said, the Gaonim had, first of all, they were he kind of comes later on and he's fighting the same fight that the Gaonim were fighting against the Karaites, for example. So the Karaites who were saying, Torah Shabbat Pei, it's all nonsense. We just go back to the text, which in and of itself is a meaningless statement, because what does the text mean? Well, it depends who's reading it, right? But okay. So the Gaonim had to hold fast against the Karaites and kind of maintain, the Jewish way of understanding. So they went to the Gemara, but the approach that they took was that the Gemara, it came to a point. I'm not trying to denigrate the Gaonim, Chalila, right? I'm not saying anything bad about them, but I'm saying how Rambam perceived them and how he perceived his job, if you will, vis-a-vis the Gaonim, right? It came to the point where they had built up these great yeshivas, and they saw it as their job to maintain the yeshivot. And one of the ways to maintain the yeshivot was to maintain a single party line. And they taught, and perhaps they really believed, I'm sure that this was really, kashitatam, that they really understood it this way, that what happens on Har Sinai is God comes down and tells everything to Moshe, and Moshe turns around and tells it to Aaron and to the Zkenim and to Yehoshua and so on and so on and so forth, and through the generations it gets garbled. And so the purpose of learning Gemara was to was to unknot all of that whole tangle all the way back to Har Sinai, because there's only one proper way to understand the halacha. Now, Rambam has the same process of God comes down, whispers in Moshe's ear, Moshe tells it to, if you read the introduction to his commentary on Mishnayot, it's the way he describes it, that God gives Moshe everything all at once. God gives the text, the written text, and the total explanation, and then Moshe turns around and says it to Aaron, and then Aaron's sons come in, and then so there's like this repeated process of Moshe telling, and then Moshe telling Aaron, and then Aaron telling his sons, and then Aaron's sons telling, etc., until everybody's heard it multiple times from each successive group that received it, right? So Rambam, in one sense, he perceives the process happening the same way that the Gaonim perceive it happening. That there's the possibility along the way of something getting garbled. But unlike the Gaonim, he comes to the opposite conclusion. He says, no, because remember what he said, which is right from the Gemara, by the way. He says, when he talks about Nevuah, about prophecy, he says, how do you know if two people are Nevi'ei Sheker, that they're false prophets? They say exactly the same thing. Because he said each human being is different. And so each prophet receives the same message from God, but will give it over differently. Because they will process it differently, based on how their mind works, based on how they experience the world. So similarly, we're not so different from prophets. Maybe it's a difference of degree, but we're also receiving the Torah in our own way. Right? And this is like the greatness of, why is there more than one human being? And so to the extent that God is giving us the Torah and that we are receiving the Torah, we each have to use our own mental gifts, our own frames of reference to understand the Torah. I can explain the Torah to you from experiences that I've had in my life. If your experience doesn't match my experience, you're going to say to me, you got it all wrong. Or you're going to say to me, that makes no sense. I can't live with this religion. Okay? So what Rambam is saying...
Or you can say there's a connection.
But what Rambam is pushing against, yes, but it requires already, I think, a little higher level of insightfulness and acceptance. That goes back to what we were saying earlier about what our theology teaches us in terms of how to behave, right? That God creates everything. Therefore, instead of me rejecting what you say, then ideally I should be saying, oh, you know what? God gave me this understanding of the Torah and gave you that understanding. Isn't that fascinating? What can I learn from you? Right? But it takes a kind of a rare individual to have that kind of an attitude. So Bezrat Hashem, I try,
This idea
excuse me?
This idea is exactly what is written in the introduction of the Tanya. Whatever you speak, everybody listen to something different.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to keep on getting away from the text, but it's all good. So whatever you say, people are going to hear it differently, right? And it's interesting because this is something I was just reviewing again this morning and writing in my notes, but it's 6 pages from here. That when you'll see this happen over and over again. And it depends on where you're coming from, right? So the Baal HaTanya and the Rambam and some other Hasidic Rebbe and a Litvish scholar and an atheist academic scholar will all quote the same text. But just to make it a very simple example, you'll have a text that comes from the Gemara, right? A Hasidic Rebbe will say, well, as we learn from the Zohar, because that text also made its way into the Zohar, right? A Litvish rabbi will say, as we read in the Gemara. And the atheist scholar will say, as we found written in Sifri, or in the Midrash, okay? So they're all quoting the same text, and they may think that they're making the same point with it, right? But, learning Torah, it's like walking through a fun house. And you're passing this endless row of mirrors, and every mirror you look in, you're going to see yourself distorted in a different way. One mirror you're tall and skinny, another mirror you're short and fat, another mirror you're here like this, right? We look at ourselves in the mirror. I recognize that it's me in each mirror, but I don't look the same from one mirror to the next. And when I come to the end and there's just a regular mirror there, I look at myself and I barely recognize myself anymore, okay? Learning Torah is the same kind of thing. We are learning the same fundamental texts, but they're processed through an infinite number of hashkafot, of points of perspective.
Filters.
The perspectives and the filters that come from what we learned, going back generations, what we experience today, something new that I just found out this morning, or another encounter that I had with another Jew who said, "Oh, isn't that interesting? I just learned this," and you say, "Oh, you know what? I never thought of it that way." So it's what an adventure! What a bracha to be able to do this. Can we learn another couple of paragraphs here? So yes. So each of these 8 spheres have the different planets and stars in them, and they lie upon one another like the skin of the onion. There's no space, no empty space between any of them. Okay, and kol hagagalim enan lo kelim velo kvedim. They're not heavy. They have no weight. And they have no color. And he says, she'anu ro'im otam ke'en hatchelet. They look to us like they're blue. You look up in the sky and say, "Oh, that's blue," right? But he says it's just our perception, because actually it has to do with how far away they are, and it's like as he translates it here, because of the height of the atmosphere, right? And they also have no physical phenomena. They don't have a flavor. They don't have a smell, and you can't really touch them. Okay, all of them makifim et haolam hen agulim ke Chadur, and they surround the world, our planet, like a ball. They're spherical, and the aretz tolya be'emta, and the earth is suspended in their midst. And some of the other spheres have some of the other planets also have other small spheres around them, and they don't really surround the earth. But a small sphere doesn't surround the earth, and it's fixed within a larger sphere, which does surround it. So he's describing this incredibly complex system of larger spheres, smaller spheres within it. They move in different directions at different speeds, and some will move counter to the other, and so on and so forth, right? But he says there are a total of 18 spheres that actually surround the earth, and then there are 8 other spheres, smaller spheres, he says, which do not completely surround the earth, and it's possible to know the number of all these spheres and the manner in which they move, and the if you will, the trajectory of their orbit from watching the movement of the planets. And he says the Greeks wrote a lot of books about this, right? So he's saying, the world, again, this is a key, I think, of Rambam's whole approach to the world, that we must rely on 2 things fundamentally. We have the revelation, Baruch Hashem, we have the Torah, right? But we also have the evidence of our own senses, of our own experience of the world. And when we look at the planets and we see them moving, we look at the stars, we see them moving, we touch this table, right? I remember what was his name. There was a famous story about a conference of philosophers from all over the world, and they were sitting and they were discussing whether or not the table exists. And it was like, theories of existence and whatever. And there's this one guy who's sitting there the whole time, just listening, and after like 3 hours of discussing whether or not the table exists, they said to him, "Well, what about you, Professor? You haven't said anything. Does this table exist?" He said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, right. He was a practitioner of Zen. That's right. He was a Zen scholar." And they said, "Well, what about you? Does this table exist?" He said, "Yes." They said, "Well, but in what sense does it exist?" He says, "In every sense." Right? And we don't have to ask questions to which we human beings, we are fond of making up questions which there's no point in answering, sort of thing. Okay, so or in a slightly different vein, as I think it's Isaac Bashevis Singer, who said, "We have to believe in free will. We have no choice."
Very good.
Right? We live in the world the way the world operates. Okay, and Rambam is saying, It's a Musar Haskell. It's a very important teaching. He's saying, don't overcomplicate it. It's complicated enough. I'm trying to strip it down and make it, a little clear, right? But you know what? Like dig into the world, touch the world, live in this world. And this is something that he comes back to also, right? He's very opposed to the notion of like withdrawing from the world and going off to meditate on a mountaintop, just as he's opposed to the idea of spending your entire life sitting locked inside a yeshiva learning Gemara. He says the purpose of learning Gemara is not to learn more Gemara, which is what his criticism was of the yeshivot, of the Geonim. That they said, there's only one right way to understand halacha, and we have to unknot all the tangles to get back to that. There's only one purpose of learning Gemara, which is to unknot that tangle, and therefore there's only one right way to learn Gemara, and you come and you sit in my yeshiva, and you will learn that right way to learn Gemara, and the purpose of learning Gemara is to learn more Gemara. And Rambam says this is nonsense. The purpose of learning Gemara is to help us to understand what God wants from us in the world. And God wants us out in the world. It says very clear in Pirkei Avot, right? But for some reason, like, not everybody buys into that, right? And so this is a very, very long detour to come to the answer of what does it mean that, that my project works here, that Rambam figured out a better way. He said, and we've touched on this before, he said it's gotten to the point where in the way that Gemara is taught in the yeshivot, people think that the purpose of learning Torah is machloket. People think that the whole purpose of sitting and learning Torah is so that you can argue with somebody else and tell them that they're stupid, right? That sounds to me an awful lot like the religion of the Emperor Cyrus that Isaiah was telling, no, you got it wrong. The world is not broken up into good and evil, black and white. The world is very complicated because all of this, God created it and God continues to create it. All of it, all the time. The world is a really complex place. And how do we deal with complexity? We deal with complexity by having rules. But the rules don't remove the complexity. They give us a guide to try to, we're in the dark and there's a rope. And we just have to keep our hand on the rope and it guides us through the dark, right? But it doesn't mean that there's no darkness around us. Yes, sir.
So what about Lishma?
What about?
What would he think about study Torah and Lishma?
So he says the purpose of, okay, very good. He's not here, but he's got a whole arichot, a whole long discussion of Torah Lishma and Torah Shelo Lishma. So the first thing, again, excuse me, but he's consistent. Because remember, he says the purpose of us learning and studying anything is to find the truth. It's not such a simple thing, but the purpose of finding the truth is only because it's true, period. So that's like the most lishma we can get, if you will, to take us out of, I want to learn the truth so that I can, so I know what stock to buy or whatever, right? And he says that learning Torah lishma or learning Torah shelo lishma, learning Torah for its own sake or not for its own sake. He says any time that we learn Torah for any purpose, and he says, but people say, I will learn Torah so that people will say I'm smart. I will learn Torah so that people will, so that I'll get a stipend to sit in yeshiva. I will learn Torah so that people will call me Rav, so people will call me Chacham. I will learn Torah so that I can become a Talmid Chacham, right? The purpose of learning Torah is, period, to learn Torah. And so there, thank you very much. There is we do have a, thank you. Thank you. So we have a specific mitzvah to learn Torah, if you will, lishma, right? Yes.
So what I hear you saying is my mind wants to introduce a different process to arrive at a truth. And is this truth, in fact, different from the one he's wanting to improve on?
Yes, I agree with that statement.
So
yes.
I'm just trying to clarify what is the truth. Because finite beings can only know subjective truth.
Right.
So where does that lead us?
Well, I think the first step for us as finite beings, like you hit on it, right? I think the first step for us as finite beings is to realize that as finite beings, we necessarily have a subjective approach to the world. And once we realize that everything we look at, we're looking at subjectively, then as was just Elon Musk was just famously quoted as like, "What's the key to your success?" He says, "I always approach every new project or every new idea that I have with the same fundamental assumption. What's that assumption? I'm probably wrong." Right? And so once we are able to approach, or don't believe everything you know, sort of thing, right? Once we're able to approach Torah learning that way, so Rambam and also Rashi, and they're not the only ones, say, in Pirkei Avot it says aseh lecha rav, that you should get somebody else to be your rav, right? And Rambam says, what does that mean? It means that you have to learn Torah at least with one other person. And the reason that you have to learn b'chavruta is if we learn Torah by ourselves, we will come to the point where we believe that we understand it. We will then believe our own shita. We will believe that we've got it right. And then when we encounter somebody else who has a slightly different or a very different interpretation, we're going to say they're wrong. We're not going to be able to say, wow, I never thought of that. Okay, so we always have to have that humility of saying, this is just the way I understand it. And by the way, this is just the way I understand it now. Because by this time tomorrow, I will have 24 hours more experience. And that will influence my thinking, whether I'm aware of it or not. So it's a big challenge to stay aware of it, right? As what's his name, Ted Lasso, right? He says, like learning Torah. He says in a different context. He says it's like riding a horse. If you're comfortable when you're doing it wrong, right? So it's a big challenge, and we have to constantly challenge ourselves, and that's like the challenge on top of the challenge. But Torah Lishma, I think, is exactly that. Ultimately, is being open to that challenge, and or as said, like I think Balatanya will say this also, to be mivatel ourselves, to kind of remove our ego from it. But just one more point on Torah Lishma, because to me the most important discussion about this. Two more points actually. So. First of all, Rambam says, even if you're learning it lo lishma, he says, mitoch lo lishma, ba lishma. Keep doing it, because even if you're doing it, quote unquote, for the wrong reason, you keep on doing it, and bit by bit, like water wearing away the stone, you'll start to come to doing things for the right reason. And that's why we have to keep. That's why it's called religious practice. We have to keep on doing it over and over again. But it's a discussion in the Gemara, which is, what's better, Talmud Torah or Ma'asim Tovim? Is it better to sit and study Torah or to go out and do good deeds in the world? So one opinion says, well, learning Torah is better because, it's learning Torah. And the other one says, but it's, Masim Tovim is better because like God wants us to do Masim Tovim. And the maskana, the conclusion of the Gemara is no. Talmud Torah is better than Masim Tovim because it leads to Masim Tovim.
לא המדרש העיקר, אלא המעשה.
But thank you. But and so that sounds like gibberish when you think of it. Oh, that's cute, but what does it mean? No, what it means is if I proceed from as there are some Jewish groups in the world today, if I proceed from the notion of just tikkun olam, saying I don't need to learn Torah, I don't need to do religious observance, I don't need to keep kosher, keep Shabbat, all that stuff, because I'm going to go out and make the world a better place, right? Proceeding from Tikkun Olam will never lead you to learning Torah, right? But proceeding from learning Torah, Bezrat Hashem, at a certain point, you're going to say, I should do this because it's a mitzvah. At the very worst. And at the very best, you're going to say, you know what? There's not enough hours in the day because I'm so impassioned about what I'm learning, but I know that there's so much that needs to be done out there in the world, and you're going to go out in the world and you're going to change the world, and then you're going to come back and learn some more, and then you're going to go out and change the world, and you're going to come back and learn some more, right? So what sounds like a cute little shtick in the Gemara is actually very profound. And what the Rambam is saying is, mitoch lo lishma, ba lishma, just keep at it. It's like you see in the, you get these flyers that say, this works even if you don't believe in it. Right? Where they want you to use holy water or put money in the charity or whatever it is, right? So Rambam is saying this works even if you don't believe in it, but you have to keep doing it. And so let's see if we can do one or two more paragraphs. I don't think we'll finish the chapter today.
You wait for the next Rabbi, we have minyan, so you can say Kaddish.
Thank you. And finally, the ninth sphere, Gagal Hatashi, the one that encompasses all the others, And he says it was divided by the Chachamim of the early generations into 12 sections. And I bet you all know what's coming, right? They gave each one of them a name based on the shapes that appeared to be formed by the stars. These are the constellations, the Mazalot, the lamb, the ox, the twins, the crab, the lion, the virgin, the scales, the scorpion, the bow, the goat, the bucket, and the fish, otherwise known as the zodiac, otherwise known as the 12 tribes, otherwise known, fast forward, as Jesus' 12 disciples, etc., 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 otherwise known as January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Thank you. Okay? So, it all comes together and it all comes from the source. And Baruch Hashem, we are, as we get deeper and deeper into Rambam, I like to think that we're getting closer and closer to the source. Thank you. Baruch Adonai Olam. Amen. Amen.